Disponible la función de interpretación español-inglés.
Let me tell you that we have simultaneous interpretation. So, and we also have the chat for the Q&A session. Please remember, you can ask your questions to the chat. This is a recorded session. Yes, this third session, it's more of a local type of research and statistics to reduce crime in cities. Mr. Thomas App of the Criminal Justice Council of the United States.
Such a pleasure to have you here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Luisa. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, with the UNODC, and all of you here today. Welcome, everyone. This is our next panel, Research and Statistics for Reducing Crime and Violence in Cities. During this session, we will explore the research and statistical requirements for effective anti-crime and anti-violence policymaking in cities and beyond. I'm joined today by three excellent panelists. I'll give you their bios briefly, as their impressive credentials can be found in the conference materials. Peter Neyroud is a lecturer in evidence-based policing at the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge University. He has been at the Institute since 2010, following an illustrious 30-year career in the police service. Peter has taught senior police leaders and advised governments all across the world, and he is also the co-chair of the Campbell Collaboration Crime and Justice Coordinating Group and an international board member of the collaboration. Javier Osorio is an assistant professor at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. He has led research projects in Mexico, Central America, and Colombia, among others, with the support from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. National Science Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, and many others. Rachel Locke is the director of Impact Peace, the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego. Prior to joining IPJ, Locke was head of research for violence prevention with Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies at New York University's Center on International Cooperation. She also previously served as a senior policy advisor with the U.S. Agency for International Development. Today's session will begin with some brief context-setting remarks from me, followed by short presentations by our panelists. And then after that, I'll ask some follow-up questions, and then we'll get to your questions. So let's get started. All right, hopefully all of you can see my screen here. So, when we consider various forms of crime and violence that are currently facing cities, we have to recognize that they come in many forms. These forms are distinct yet interrelated, and they share some attributes, but not others. And so I'd like to propose that rather than considering these various forms of crime and violence as distinct and separate, we need some other typology that can reflect the sort of interacting nature and overlapping nature of these. And so I'd like to propose that we think of these various types of crime and violence along a continuum. This is taken from a paper that Chris Rinship and I wrote in 2016, What Works in Reducing Community Violence. And as you can see, this continuum represents various forms of violence. Here we have bullying, intimate partner violence, community violence, gang violence, organized criminal violence, and state violence. And roughly speaking, what's happening here is that these various forms of violence are overlapping, as you can see. This is not meant to reflect how much they overlap, but it's meant to indicate that they do in fact overlap, and that they sort of move from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, from sort of less organized forms of crime and violence to more organized forms of violence. And so they all and then you can look at these various attributes that they share or don't share. So, bullying is rarely lethal. It occurs mostly in private settings. It involves, few individuals per incident. It's spontaneous, it's expressive of emotion, and it's happening all the time. State-sponsored conflict, wars between states are frequently lethal. They occur in public spaces. They involve many people. They're planned. They're instrumental, meaning not emotional. They're used to achieve, concrete political and other aims. And thankfully, in terms of incidents, they happen relatively infrequently. Now, this is just one continuum. I've been trying to customize this and adapt it and update it based on input and feedback from others. Here's a more recent version with home, school, community, gang, organized, and state violence again. During a collaboration with the No Violence effort, they took this continuum and made it their own. And as you can see, they included institutions, schools, online, community, public spaces, and others. Here is an updated working version where I'm looking at many of these issues. I'm adding terrorism and ethnic conflict. And I'm starting to think about here whether some of this can be organized in terms of conflicts among intimates, conflicts among non-strangers, people who are known to one another but not necessarily close, and then of course conflicts among strangers. There's no one perfect way to organize this, and as you can see here, looking across this spectrum, perhaps the left side of the spectrum is focused more on interpersonal violence. The center of it is focused more on criminal violence, and then the far right is focused more on political violence. The point here is not to endorse any one particular set. All of you might be able to improve upon this, and if you can, please do. The point is to recognize that for each of these different problems, there are different solutions, and there are different needs. For every form of crime and violence, there's a unique set of evidentiary and statistical challenges. And these challenges are related, but not identical. So the research and statistics that we need to understand community violence is likely different than the research and statistics we need to understand terrorism or domestic radicalization or domestic violence. Cities are a critical locus for all these forms of crime and violence, and they're a key context where all of these forms of violence are happening both independently and dependently and simultaneously. So that's a little bit about by way of setting up this conversation. And so now I'd like to turn to Peter Neyroud for his presentation. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. There we go. Just waiting to get the button to come up in the bottom left-hand corner. I'm going to focus on another way of slicing and dicing the issue, and I want to go to the next slide.
Peter, I'm controlling the slide, so just
right. Could you take me to the next slide in that case? So I know who I am. So I've picked up the Thomas's approach, which I like because this lecture is supposed to, or this discussion is supposed to be focused on policy making, and actually a pretty practical way of approaching that as well. I like it because it starts to get us into the territory where we don't think of crime as a single unitary problem, and we begin to appreciate the differences between different types of crime. There are as Thomas has pointed out in his introduction, there are very different characteristics from left to right of this screen, from, as he puts it, rarely lethal through to potentially much more frequently lethal. And again, the scale and commonality, the circles on this don't actually represent the scale of the count, although they might, as we'll see in a minute, more accurately represent the scale of the harm, particularly to individual victims of that model. If I go to the next slide. Because the critical thing with policymaking is that if your to-do list is everything, and if you're counting every crime as a single incident without differentiation, the solutions tend to be equally simplistic, i.e. just using more resources, more cops, more police to do the job. and given the international debate about whether police are being applied to the right things, it really matters to be differentiating. This is the fastest moving set of slides I've ever seen, Thomas. Next, please, if I could. So adding to Thomas's analysis, I just wanted to dig in a little bit to what this means for statistics. If you look at to the circles to the left-hand side, clearly reporting levels vary by crime and they vary by jurisdiction. If we look at things like the International Crime Victims Survey, the level of reporting varies widely, but it's broadly the patterns are broadly consistent across jurisdiction. We tend to be reporting more of the crimes on the left-hand side. That recording tends to be done by the police in most countries, and it focuses on incidents rather than patterns. And what it is particularly bad at doing is giving us an idea of patterns, sequences, and locations. And just to give an example of that, we do know from the increasing amount of knowledge of detailed analysis of, for example, intimate partner violence, that just focusing on incidents is a really bad way of constructing solutions to intimate partner violence, because it is fundamentally something that goes in patterns and sequences. And recording by individual incident tends to produce a very reactive approach, and an approach in which victims see a response which is inadequate to solve the problems. And also it's a response that focuses on one of the two parties, the dyad involved in the incident. And the dilemma for governments then as well is the dilemma between encouraging reporting or trying to focus on reduction. The two are often in conflict, particularly in areas like serious sexual assault and domestic violence. And then if you go to the right-hand side, reporting is clearly much less frequent. If you're talking about organized crime, much less frequent. And unless there are third-party victims of organized crime, for example, the recording by police and law enforcement actually tends to focus not so much on the incidents, but on some of the outputs, the seizures, and again, tends to not focus on patterns, networks, and locations. And if you're trying to deal with organized and gang crime, you want to be able to understand the patterns, the networks, and locations, but you also want to understand whether one gang or one activity in organized crime is more harmful than another, so that you can begin to understand where the scarce resources and their expensive resources and the very intrusive tactics that you necessarily need on that right-hand side can be most appropriately applied. Next slide, please. And just as an example of where these things tend to go badly wrong, this particular slide is showing the response by police forces in the UK. It happens to be 2013, but unfortunately it hasn't changed that much since then. The pattern of responses of risk assessment in police forces to domestic violence. The green indicates that the incidents have been recorded as a standard risk, i.e. they're low risk. The blue, that they're high risk. These police forces are fundamentally reporting the same types of incident because they're reporting individual incidents and they're applying a flawed risk assessment tool to it. What you end up with is a completely bizarre arrangement of prioritization. It's not consistent. It's taking individual incidents and making a judgment, and it's inserting a culture, which in many cases here is not one that's going to lead to effective use of resources. Next slide. And that brings the other growing challenge that goes with the bare statistics, and that is the challenge of how to assess the risk based on the kind of based on the reporting tools that we've got available to us. The tendency, as that domestic violence risk assessment tool in the UK, and frankly most of the rest of the world, there are simply no good operational frontline field risk assessment tools in being to help the police to deal with intimate partner violence effectively at first call. But what they tend to do is they tend to lead to reactive demand-led policing. They tend to lead to risk tools that replicate that approach, that treat high risk, high percentages as high risk, because police organizations as bureaucracies, and it's not the police alone in this particular context either, tend to veer towards safety first, and therefore more things get graded as high risk, more intrusive approaches get put in place, and the result is over treatment in many cases, over expenditure of resources to deal with things that perhaps could be resolved in different ways. and the overuse of delegitimizing strategies such as stop and search for things that could be dealt with more thoughtfully with problem-solving approaches, more thoughtfully with community-based approaches. And then on the other side, a risk assessment applied on the basis of the recording systems in gang and organized crime tends to end up with performance frameworks driven by governments that put quick win policing and symbolic successes. So, you know, the classic of police chief standing in front of a large pile of seized drugs, basically of very little assistance in the fight against drugs, doesn't deal with the harm, but it's a great picture, and every police chief is happy to stand in front of it. Simply counting the amount of drugs in a world in which those globalized networks have been pretty successful in getting drugs to the front line is not an effective way of dealing with the harm. So it becomes a very incident-driven rather than strategic approach to harm reduction, symbolic rather than effective. Next slide. And having worked, as Thomas said, I was a police chief, but I also led the National Policing Improvement Agency in the UK, which was an agency designed to, as it said, to provide improvement to policing. And we were constantly confronted when we were trying to improve the performance of the police, the drive to targets based on incidents, which meant that literally for a police chief constable who was trying to make clever decisions about how to apply their resources to try and solve problems, that they were finding their murder rate based with their effectiveness in dealing with simple theft. As I put it, murder carries no more importance than apprehending someone who'd stolen a bottle of milk. And the other side of that is that type of piling it high and watching the big numbers means that police chiefs, leaders in social services, in probation services, in prison services, tend to be focused on the big numbers, not on the harmful. They tend to have their attention diverted from things that are much more difficult to count, like missing persons that are ending up being human trafficked. They tend to miss the vulnerable youngsters because they don't count as a crime in many cases. They're just not focused on the things that really do harm. Next slide. What we've been trying to develop as a counterpoint to that, to at least deflect the attention away from incident-driven statistics, is what we've called the Cambridge Crime Harm Index. We've introduced it in a whole range of countries, mostly through our senior police leader students, but also through others in the criminal justice system. We've got models in Asia, we've got models in Australasia, we've got models from the USA. A number of countries, including Canada, have already got severity indices which do a similar job. And the aim here is so that when you're looking at your crime problems, when you're trying to decide your priorities, you are not just simply looking at the simple numbers, you're also looking at weighted numbers. Next slide. And in our terms, the weighted number based on, this is the UK model of doing it, we take the sentencing guidelines. Not every country has sentencing guidelines, but every country has sentences delivered, and we can work from sentences delivered as well. We take the sentencing guidelines for offenders who've not previously been involved in the system, so that we've not got mitigation and factors or factors that aggravate the offence based on their prior offending. We convert the standard sentence that they would expect to get, the starting point, into a number of days in prison, and then we apply that, as it shows on the right-hand column on this slide. We apply that as a weighting factor. So homicide in the UK, you get 5,475 points. That weights against a simple theft, which will get you either 1 or 0.5, and we then apply that to the crime statistics. Next. And you need to, we need the green one first. So this happens to be Perth in Western Australia, using the Western Australia Crime Harm Index. This is standard crime count, and you can see that most of the peaks, and by the way, what look like buildings actually are, one of them is a shopping centre where there's quite a lot of crime count, low level crime incident count. If you convert that in the next slide, the transition, that's harm. You get a completely different set of patterns. They're much sharper, they're much more concentrated. And if you dig underneath the harm, you start to find the intimate partner violence, the more serious end of that crime. You start to find some of the organized crime behaviors. You start to find harm spots of street robbery. You start to find places where focusing 2% of locations where the harm is at its greatest. You've got 80% of your harm in some of the cities that we've surveyed. You have a much better chance of starting where the harm is really focused. Next slide. And that applies as well if you're taking in a collective offender-based approach, because if you start to think about the points of opportunity to intervene, ranging from predicting pre-offence to handling offenders post-conviction and sentence, if you weight by harm, not simply by incident or by individual crime, you've got a much better chance. For example, on prediction, we know that around about, and we've done this work across a number of different jurisdictions, we know that about 2% of the offenders that come into the system have the highest propensity to commit high harm offences. More than 60% have very little propensity to commit any further or indeed high harm offences. So focusing on the 2% gives you an opportunity, firstly, to work out where to start, secondly, to begin to focus your activities, but also on the post-arrest process, to begin to work out those who can be diverted safely without having to come in contact with the criminal justice system, and those for whom some sort of priority or enhanced case system working between prosecutors and probation services and police can be put into a place where the public can be safer. Next slide. And this leads me to a slightly different, and I've deliberately changed Thomas's colours. This leads us to a slightly different pattern where, on the left-hand side, you would apply, we suggest, a mixed strategy of harm and crime count to map locations. You obviously want to understand areas where there's a huge crime count, but mixing harm and crime count, as we've done in, for example, Copenhagen, with one of our senior police students, we worked out that there was a very distinct pattern between harm and crime count. Both mattered, and the places where they intersected tended to be the places where real attention and problem solving was necessary. We can do the same with dyads in intimate partner violence, so couples. We can do the same with offenders. We can do the same with victims. The number of, if you look at victim data with using that mixture, you end up finding out that around about 2 to 3% of victims suffer about 80% of harm. Why would you not be starting with those victims rather than others in order to provide means of preventing them being re-victimized? And applying problem-solving approaches and other approaches that are supported by the systematic reviews that the Campbell collaboration is increasingly creating and updating seems like a good place to start, by using evidence to focus effort. And in terms of our kind of a wider approach to the rule of law, applying the least intervention to deal with the problem, not applying a heavy-handed approach across everything. And then on the right-hand side, similar type of approach, but much more focused on networks with harm, to identify the most harmful actors, the most harmful networks, the most vulnerable victims and systems, because that, for example, could be cybercrime systems that are most vulnerable to cybercrime, targeting that 2% most harmful and most harmed in a very systematic way, and in a way that we're using our resources in the most efficient and effective way in order to prevent harm to the public. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. Much to think about there. Javier, let's turn to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Can we move to the next slide, please? And the next one. I'm going to be talking about the opportunities and challenges of providing evidence-based security policies. As Thomas and Peter mentioned, we have enormous challenges, particularly in Latin America, which is the area where I'm mostly focused on. We have very complex, rapidly changing, multi-causal problems that are also pervasive in different places, right? At the micro level, personal interactions, open spaces at the meso level, but also macro in terms of organized crime, state repression, and even transnational crime that cross country boundaries. And depending on the level of harm, as Peter mentioned, all of these problems demand urgent attention. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So in order to provide solutions, we need something that actually works, right? But something that works is not only something that ultimately solves the problems, but in terms of the implementation, How can we make sure this works? First of all, it needs to be institutionally feasible. That means that the institution in charge of implementing that policy needs to have the institutional mandate and the legal support to do that. We also need a budget. Yes, we need actually budget to hire people to conduct policies. We need the technical feasibility in terms of resources, materials, institutional reach to actually deploy the policy to where it's intended in terms of the population we want to address. And we also need all these to be sustainable. A policy cannot be a one-shot policy. It needs something to be able to stay over time. And all this has to be also politically viable. Can we move to the next slide, please? So all these are opportunities for a policy to fail, which we haven't even got to the place of actually implementing the policy. Next one, please. So assuming that all these things are in place, what is it that we can actually do to solve security problems? Do we have policies that actually work? Next slide, please. These are very quick. So sometimes we don't know, right? Where is the answer to whether a policy, security policy works or not? Next, please. Part of the answer comes from developing data. This is what we call evidence-based security policies. And for that, comments to UNODC and the Center of Excellence. They've been doing a great job over the years to actually help countries develop the basic data infrastructure to start providing answers to what works to reduce crime and harm in different Latin American cities and countries in general. Next slide, please. But we have a challenge here. It's not only a matter of developing data. That is just part of the solution. In order to solve the problem of insecurity around the world, we first need to identify a clearly defined aspect of the problem. Can we click next? This is going to start popping up some hexagons. So we need to identify the problem. Next, please. The second one is, once we have a problem, what is the actual solution to address that specific problem? Given that we have multi-causal, very complex, rapidly changing problems, we need a very specific policy to address a very specific problem. Next. In order to measure whether we're going to have an effect or not, we need data infrastructure. We need the state capacity to monitor data. And oftentimes we have problems of crime underreporting. People have different reasons for not reporting data, and even the data that gets reported sometimes is not with sufficient granularity, quality, or timely delivery for this information to actually be valid data. Next, please. Next one, please. So once we have, assuming that we have a clearly defined problem, a clear solution or a parent solution, and we have all the data of data production in place, we need analysts who actually can extract some added value to these data, raw data input to actually inform decision making. Next, please. And decision makers then can evaluate whether this policy actually works or not, and whether it's like something politically viable or given the resources that the country has at its disposal to actually address the problems. But focusing just on data is not the only solution. Actually, what we need to have, and that comes at the beginning, not at the end, is a deliberate intent to put all these data mechanisms in place to actually evaluate the policy. Having an evaluation approach relies on data, but it's not only about data. It's about where are we going to implement the policy, where are we going to measure, whether we contrast the implemented space or wherever we didn't have the implementation deployed. All those decisions have to be made before we actually deploy the policy. So it's not after you go to the field, you try to implement something and then say, okay, did it work or not? Let's try to measure. Oh, we forgot about asking this. We don't have this measure in place to actually measure the impact of evaluation. So this intention to evaluate has to come at the beginning and put all the different components in place to actually eventually deliver the promise of evidence-based evaluation. Okay, we're going to the next one, please. Yes. So data is just half of the solution. Having data is not enough. We need to add research value to it and scientifically rigorous research. Next, please. And that comes with the gold standard is impact evaluation through randomized controlled trials. Not everything can be randomized. Probably not everything should be randomized for legal or ethical purposes, but we at least can try to find quasi-experimental research that help us to evaluate the contrast of the counterfactual. What would have happened if we haven't done this policy? What would be the effects on the behavior that we want to assess? And we need to measure that with a baseline that is a metric before the implementation, contrasting control and treatment groups, and then an end-line evaluation to see whether over time and across groups, we have changes in behavior. And when we say that a policy works or not, we need to be more sophisticated and just say yes or no. We need to say, hey, did it actually increase or decrease? Maybe one single impact has consequences on many different types of behaviors. Consider, for example, hotspot policing, that you might actually reduce crime in one area, but that deflects crime and increases in some other parts of the city, right? So it's not only about the direction, also the magnitude. Does that increase a lot or just a little? And something very important is to consider the certainty, the margins of confidence about this. Once we have these pieces of information in place, whether a policy has an effect or not, what is the magnitude of the effect, how certain we are about the effect, then decision makers can actually evaluate the cost benefits. How effective in terms of how much money or resources we commit to this policy that actually delivers or not. And based on that, then we can start talking about alternatives, whether to fix some things that are not working, or discard things that are actually harmful or counterproductive, or actually scale off things that are promising to eventually deploy these nationwide. Next, please. So there are different challenges of actually putting researchers and government officials together. Government officials, and this is kind of an oversimplification, tend to implement policies by inertia or good intentions, but without actually really know whether these things work or not. Oftentimes is reactive. They're incredibly constrained by budget, policies, institutional characteristics, capacity. And unfortunately, we have, given the security concerns that many of these aspects interfere with, a lot of the time this data or the implementation of it is not transparent for security reasons or national security sometimes. On the other side, we have sometimes researchers who are oblivious about those challenges because they're not practitioners. They just live in their ivory tower, or we live in our ivory tower, and we rarely come down from it. We also have a wide range of methodological sophistication from researchers, from soft liners to really, really hard liners who are actually even more oblivious to the challenges of implementing policies. We have long-term incentives in the academic community that sometimes do not overlap with the rapid response that governments need, and also publication incentives, which are sometimes opposite to the lack of transparency of government agencies for national security reasons. Next slide, please. So how can we start building bridges between government and researchers? There has to be intention to do that. And some countries have a lot more advanced efforts on that than others, but there are ways to move forward. In terms of applying these, we basically need to sit everybody in the cafeteria in the middle. And there are different strategies that we can talk about, and I can talk about my experience on that in the Q&A. Next, please. So for the sake of time, I'm going to show you two examples of the things that I've been doing over time. Next one, please. One is with the support of USAID and the Attorney General Office in El Salvador, we conducted a very small $50,000. This is actually very small in terms of the budget that usual security apparatuses carry on. We conducted a very small randomized control trial focused on pretrial detention. When a person is arrested, most of the time they get put in jail, just waiting for the trial. And given the judicial lag in El Salvador, this could take several months, if not years, just being in jail, waiting for trial. So this RCT conducted a legal training for public defense lawyers. We also gave him an enhanced protocol so they can increase the chances of maximizing pre-trial's release. And we also gave in material resources like computers, cell phones, so they can quickly communicate with their relatives, so they can provide information or evidence in favor of the detainee. And this very small intervention in terms of the size and the scope, only for municipalities with 160 public defenders, actually showed statistically significant results. We increased by a magnitude of almost 10% the number of requests that public defenders actually presented to the judges to actually request pre-trial release. So this person does not go to jail waiting for trial. And in terms of the pre-trial release granted, we also saw almost a 5% increase in terms of the people who actually escaping, putting in prison, just waiting for trial. So this is a very clear example of something that we can do in a small environment with a country with limited resources. Next, please. I'm going to skip this. This is another upcoming project on gang recruitment. Next one. And I have also been working on large-scale data innovations. Next one, please. I have two projects, one in Colombia and another one in Mexico, using computerized social sciences to track over time the behavior of, in Colombia, criminal organizations, but also insurgent groups, paramilitary, and also violations of human rights from state forces. And on the Mexican case, we have about 200 organized criminal groups. Next slide, please. And you can click twice to activate the videos, maybe one more. If you hover over the video, it's going to show a play button. Maybe not. Okay. Anyway, you can go to those websites, and there you can see how we can use public information using computerized systems to extract all this information from human rights reports, from press releases, from government agencies, also media reports from news articles, to actually extract the information of where are these groups active, when and where, and all this information is at the municipality daily level. Disaggregating, in the case of Mexico, about 200 criminal organizations aggregated by big cartels, but also disaggregating them over time and across the space. So these are things that academia can help to put information on the hands of the government, but not only the government, but also civil society and media, or the general academic community, to keep advancing possible solutions to these problems. And with that, I finish. Thank you very much. Let's finish that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thomas, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much, Javier. That was excellent. Much food for thought. Rachel, turning to you now. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here this morning and look forward to the conversation.
Es un gusto para mí estar aquí y voy a hablar un poco sobre el ecosistema en el que todos operamos y del que estamos hablando. Comenzaré con una imagen muy
on how different conflict violence dynamics are interacting with one another, that around the world today, our most violent situations are linked to gang warfare, organized or drug-related crime, state brutality, murder by non-state actors, and heightened levels of political violence, interpersonal violence. These are both distinct and interacting with one another and overlapping with one another. And it's important that we sort of refresh ourselves in thinking about this within this conversation, because I find very often these discussions get very specific very quickly, and that is good because different types of violence and different types of crime require specific strategies. And also different types of violence and different types of crime feed off of one another. And if we don't understand that and we don't understand the ecosystem of that, then we can, in fact, advance policies and practices that do harm at the worst, and at the least are less effective than they could be. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning within this sort of bird's eye perspective is that in many states in the world today, political power is dependent upon a redistribution of rents, and that very often criminal enterprises are part of that redistribution process. And so the political is inherently linked to the criminal in how we're thinking about power at the state level. Next slide, please. So I want to take Thomas's point at the beginning as of cities as sort of the locus. Much of the violence that we see, and when I speak to crime, I will be speaking mainly to violent crime, takes place outside of conflict zones, much of that in cities where the majority of humanity resides and the majority of humanity will continue to reside, and where in many parts of the world, for example, in Africa, population growth will be massively concentrated in urban areas. It's worth reminding ourselves that much of this will be concentrated further in informal settlements and slum areas of cities. So these are areas that are not already facing contracted resources in the sense of jobs or water, sanitation, schools, etc., but also areas that have historically not a great relationship between residents and the government, and that would extend as well to law enforcement. So massive migration to cities, massive migration to parts of cities that are already underprepared to deal with a wide range of human needs. In addition, we're seeing a huge rise in inequality globally and in our cities. And so how resources are distributed is not trending in a direction that is a positive one. And from a conflict perspective, inequality is a driver of conflict. So this should be a risk factor that we should all be concerned about. Next slide, please. I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide here to make sure that we sort of remind ourselves that in the conversations of data and research and statistics that we're not sort of missing the way in which all of these things are interconnected. So we don't want to be only looking at the forest and not the trees. We don't want to only be looking at the trees and not the forest. We have to be doing both at the same time. And picking up Peter's point from earlier, it is both essential to be collecting incident level data and systemic data. It is also important that that comes with analysis, so that we're not just collecting these points, these data points, and kind of reacting to them, but also really thinking through what these data points tell us. And we can best do this, I think, where we amplify and collaborate the work of others. So frankly, not all institutions are great at looking at systematic patterns, but they're very good at collecting incident level data. That's fine, as long as there are means of cooperation and collaboration. And I think all too often there's a competition between agencies rather than a partnership. This is particularly important, going back to my previous point, if we understand that patterns of violence are both distinct and multi-sectoral. So violence within the home needs a distinct and specific intervention that is built on evidence of effectiveness. We also should understand that high rates of violence within the home could increase the predisposition of people to behave violently outside of the home. So exposure to violence being a risk factor for increased violence in other domains and arenas. So we need to have practices and policies that are targeted at both types of violence and also recognize the way in which these types of violence can be reinforcing and require multi-sectoral responses. I also think it's really important that data accompanies a narrative that is inclusive. So where we limit voices in the conversation about data collection, we don't fully appreciate harm. So if we are just having a narrative of seizures of narcotics or arrests of violent actors, but we are not opening space for people to talk about how those arrests have a deleterious impact on household economic viability or the ability for children within a household to go to school, or trauma levels within that household, then we're not fully understanding the harm. So there needs to be a real intentional inclusivity and a diversity of voices in these conversations. Connected to that is the fact that very often data neglects a large number of people. So very often we'll talk about citizen data, but that leaves out a huge number of people who may not have citizenship. So stateless populations or people who are living below the radar of citizenship. And in such a way, if we're not including those individuals, then there's a high potential for our data to be harming certain categories of people. And we need to, again, be always mindful of who the data is harming. I won't go too far into this because that's a whole separate conversation unto itself, but this is particularly important in conversations about AI and use of technology to be collecting data on individuals and behavior patterns. Going back to a point I mentioned above, I think we can use data to build partnerships. We have good evidence, including some, Thomas, that you have done on how imperative it is for partnerships to be built and sustained in order to help us achieve our violence prevention and reduction objectives. Data very often is used. There's sort of a de facto competition that data creates. And I think actually if we're creative about it, we can use data for collaboration to overcome some of that competition. And then my last point here is going back to a point that I said at the beginning, which is that criminal violence today in many parts of the world is so much a part of state structures that separating the criminal from the political can be counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. That doesn't mean that we don't have nuanced and specific data, but it does mean that we are very mindful of context and where we need to be connecting these two things together. Next slide, please. So I co-facilitate a network called Peace in Our Cities, which has 20 cities from around the world, over 24 organizing partners, including UNODC, I'm happy to say, involved in trying to advance sort of knowledge of this, the scale and scope of evidence and tools that we have to address violence, to share information across cities, to use evidence to propel positive change in cities. And these are some of the things that we have heard directly from our city partners, by which I mean both city government partners and city civil society partners. So you can go through these, I won't read them all, but I think what's important here is that it's not just sort of the technical, it's not just what data you collect and how you collect it, it is also how you communicate that, both within your government, within your civil society networks, as well as with residents of your city, how you do that, how you bring certain practices to your locale when there may be a demand for a heavy-handed law enforcement or securitized response. How do you introduce something that's different to people? How do you also think about structural impediments to peace? So that could be people's feelings of lack of security in public transportation, for example. How do you bring in a range of different perspectives that informs risk factors and informs people's feelings of being able to lead healthy, safe, and productive environments? And one point that I do also want to pick out from this, and this is particular to the past year plus that we have had, but I think is not only relevant to that, is that many of our city partners have asked for support in thinking about what data is needed to be collective in crises, and how do you adapt your data systems when there is a crisis that might be a global pandemic, or it might be the onset of conflict in a neighboring state that produces a huge wave of displaced refugee populations to your city. So thinking about this more static kind of collection of data and then adaptive. Next slide, please. So my final 2 points are just, there's a lot that can be done, right, at city level, at national government level, and with our international partners. I think I've spoken quite a bit about city level, so let me just highlight at the national level really, and I think Javier, your point about investing resources, financial resources is a big one. So woefully inadequate investment in the resources that are needed here to address crime and violence at the city level. What we have found among our city partners as well is that positive relationships with their national governments can go a huge way, and where national governments and city partners are working at cross purposes, it's a major impediment to making progress. So really trying to find practical ways to reinforce that relationship is a part of this problem set. And we often separate those two, and we need to think more about the relationship between them. Reinforcing relationships with civil society, academia, and private sector, let's not leave them out. And also the delegation, the just delegation of law enforcement in many countries, that's a national level, not a city level. I think also importantly, it's imperative for international partners to sort of create opportunities to share evidence-informed practice. This conference is one example of that, but there are a lot of city-to-city networks that are striving to do this and could do much more if there were really greater investment from international partners. Also spotlighting when we talk about prevention, not just the usual suspects. So most people know sort of the Medellin story. That's great. We should keep talking about it. There are a lot of other examples and stories out there. We shouldn't just think that there's one or two examples of successful violence and crime prevention. There are many others. I would also want to say just a point here that we often don't talk about, which is investing in protecting independent journalists is critical here. And this goes back to my point at the beginning, again, about the types of violence and crime that we're seeing and just how complicit in many states and countries in the world today, criminal actors are with state structures. And if you don't have independent journalists and media shining a light on that, then frankly, we're all in trouble. I have a final slide. It'll take me 10 seconds, I promise, which is just, don't forget the Sustainable Development Goals. It's ambitious, it's integrated, it's universal. There's a localized emphasis, an emphasis on partnerships, and many of the sort of checkpoints to make sure that we're not falling into traps actually exist if we look at the SDGs. So always want to bring us back to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a fantastic presentation. And I'm going to come straight to you for our first question, Rachel. And I apologize, it's a very difficult one, which is, you've discussed how organized criminal actors can co-opt or even capture state governments. And while we know that investments in data systems are sort of long-term investments in the future capacity of these governments to reduce crime and violence, they also, as Justice Brandeis said, Supreme Court Justice here in the United States famously said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So this, investing more in data and bringing that data to light can also sort of show where governments are falling short or where they might even be complicit. So all of that to say, how do we coax governments to make these long-term investments that might not be in their short-term self-interest?
Softball question. I appreciate it. Thank you for that. So I don't know that there's a silver bullet answer to this, as there isn't for most things, right? But I think part of it is what I said at the end. So part of it is really investing in independent media and journalists. I would say that as a reminder there is a trend line towards increasing attacks and murders of journalists and human rights defenders around the world. So that's the context in which we are having this conversation. And if there is less space for that and fewer people shining the light, it's going to make all of this more difficult. So I do think that's part of it. I think another part of it is that we can't just rely on national governments, right? We have to rely on, and this was part of why I set my second to last slide up this way, we have to really be engaging subnational, so whether that's city or state or county or department actors who can serve as a counter force to national governments that might be more leaning towards a sort of populist-led type of policy that is in fact infringing on rights and complicit with organized criminal groups. And I think the international community has a huge role to play in that as well, pushing back against that. We are in an era where there is a fragmentation and weakening, frankly, of our international system. And so continuing to invest in that and continuing to make sure that the agencies and component parts of the UN, UNODC and others are pushing for that is crucially important. And then the last part, and I'm sure others have answers to this question as well, is that I think we just need to keep talking about it, right? So part of it is that we can't just say violence in Honduras or El Salvador, and I'm just going to pick on those places, but this is true in many other countries, is gang violence. We can't let the government off the hook, if you will. In other words, we can't not talk about the way in which governments are part of the challenge, part of the ecosystem of violence, just as we can't talk about violence in El Salvador as only a gang problem and not talk about other forms of exceptionally high rates of violence in El Salvador, including violence against women, which is among, if not the highest in the hemisphere and rarely talked about. So we can't just have one frame, one way that we're describing violence. We have to be much more kind of nuanced and complex.
Thank you, Rachel. Peter, Javier, anything to add in this area?
Well, I naturally, because my career was as a police officer, I mean, one really important thing to bear in mind is to find ways to equip police leaders in places where there's a tendency to aim, so in Central American terms, towards mano dure, over emphasis on violent policing in order to counter violence, to provide the police leaders and particularly up and coming middle managers with the education and training which offers them solutions which don't involve that. I mean, evidence-based training, evidence-based policing is important for more reasons than have been mentioned so far. It's important because it's giving people skills and alternatives. And there are, I'm an optimist, there are enough good people that, given the opportunity to do something differently, to work with communities to solve problems, to, there's a range of ways that you can accomplish the same ends without having to adopt heavy-handed street tactics, without having to adopt encounter shootings, because I spent a lot of time directing a program in India before the pandemic. The more that you can equip people with alternatives and ways in which they can do things differently, the better chances you've got.
Thank you. Javier, any thoughts?
Yes, I mean, this is a really good provocative question, right? How can we start building these connections? On a practical manner, I think just creating from the academia the opportunity to engage in policy labs with government agencies. You can sign at the beginning, kind of, no dissemination agreements, everything stays secret. But the academia were good at doing research, and the government is so busy catching criminals or dodging bullets that they don't have the time or resources sometimes to actually develop research to assess whether things work or not. And let me just focus, for example, on the Mexican case. As Rachel mentioned, the importance of organized crime in Mexico is a primary concern of security and has been for the last 20 years, probably, and is not going anywhere. So what is the government doing? The information that we have available, publicly available, is limited. It's not very good quality, sometimes comes in PDF, which is very hard to work with in terms of research. But we just have a little bit of information on the end of it, the criminal side or the manifestations of violence. But we have very little information about what the government is doing. What are the different levers that the government is actually pushing or pulling to actually try to fix the problem? This actually, if you cannot connect the implementation with the outcome, it's very hard to assess whether these things work or not. Creating a policy lab, working with governments can be an opportunity first, as Peter mentioned, to train people so they can do internally. And universities, academia, they were good at training professionals. They will just need to commit resources and institutional room for actually hosting these teams, and we can train them. In the process of doing that, because it takes several years of actually developing the human capacity for doing that, academia and governments can collaborate in actually identifying what works or not. That will bring not only better decision making, sometimes reduced harm reduction, which are actually policies that fire back and are counterproductive, and help governments to explore different approaches in the harm reduction stance rather than just like punitive mano dura approaches. All that has to come with shared responsibility and accountability. Unfortunately, given the secrecy that comes and the legitimate security concerns that many government officials face, they have reasons why not to tell you how many soldiers they have stationed in different areas of the country to fight organized crime, because then maybe those troops get fired. But there's an important aspect of bringing everybody together, starting creating channels to bring people together to explore solutions. And eventually governments have to be accountable to what things work and keep doing more of those, and things that do not work, like the war against drugs, hemispherically, globally, has not paid off in 50 years. Why do we keep doing that? Maybe it's time to actually put in research and governments actually in dialogue to start working on that.
Javier, let me follow up with you on a separate question, which is, you mentioned in your presentation the importance of randomized controlled trials. You also noted that at times you'll need something short of randomization in terms of a quasi experiment. Candidly, I'm a bit exhausted by the perennial sort of debate about sort of methodological rigor, RCTs versus non-RCTs, this hierarchy of evidence. Is there some way that we can move past this discussion where we can sort of acknowledge that evidence at various sort of levels of rigor is valuable, and yet note that, especially for establishing causal inferences, that some evidence is in fact more valuable than others? Because I feel like there's this constant sort of all or nothing conversation. That methods are not important. That all methods are sort of equal, or that there's really only one method. So how do we make this a more sophisticated conversation?
I totally agree with this, that it serves nobody to have a minimalistic zero-sum black or white approach, right? Isn't that if something is not RCT or randomized, then doesn't work? No, actually, that is not the case. I think the way to move forward the conversation is to drop all the weapons like methodological arguments and start engaging in a dialogue that adds up. Not everything can be randomized, not everything should be randomized. And even if you do that, maybe the piece of information that you get from here could be valid in one specific locale, but not replicable somewhere else. That's where you need to start a dialogue. This is part of the dialogue that rarely happens, not only between across fields in academia, but even more so, it's a lot more rare between academia and government. What things work or not, we need to start putting dialogue on the table, evidence on the table for all the qualities and rigor, because eventually these, as I mentioned at the beginning, these problems are so complex that just putting the lamp on one side does not illuminate the whole problem. As Rachel mentions, many things actually, if you create data, you might be counterproductive in terms of what you're trying to achieve or hurting others people. So we need to put people on the table, dialogue, evidence from the different multidisciplinary approaches to eventually come together to find solutions that work in specific locales. Not everything has to work everywhere for all the sectors, for all the dimensions. but government authorities are obligated to serve the populations, and that's where the responses really matter. And those will come in different forms.
Thank you. Peter, I suggest that I suspect you might have some feelings about this subject.
Yeah, quite a few. First of all, just to point out that, we've got a lot more experimental evidence than most people think. I've been working with a colleague, the other co-chair, Lorraine Mazerol, on just looking at the extent of the global experiments we've got in policing. And it's only a decade ago when we thought we had only just had about 100 or so. We're well over 600 RCTs in policing, and furthermore now in a huge range of different countries, increasingly in the global south. And so it's perfectly possible to do them. It's that methodological debate often misses the most important thing, and that is that one of the things that an RCT does is it doesn't just evaluate. It allows you to really understand how a thing can be implemented at its most effective. And quite a lot of the methodological debate is focused on t-tests and numbers, and it completely misses the fact that what administrators and police leaders need to understand is, how do I get this to work? An RCT is a really great way of documenting the steps that are necessary to make something work effectively. And if you align that as well with an understanding that, again, it's not everything doesn't have to be an RCT. Really good descriptive studies. We keep telling our senior police leader students across the world, really understanding what is actually going on now, documenting from the best available statistics from a range of different sources, as Rachel said, is a really good starting place. Then, making sure that you implement things properly. So really good case studies of implementation that can be shared with colleagues is another good way to move things forward. RCTs used at the point where you've got a damn good hypothesis that something probably is going to work, and you use the RCT as much as anything else, as both to evaluate, but also to make sure that you've really got a decent implementation structure. And on top of that, really tracking the outcomes and the outputs, and doing so in trying to engage as many different players in that process as possible, so that you end up with an ownership of the approach, not just one institution declaring or an academic declaring and publishing an article and then marching off into the sunset.
Let me just follow up. This is a discussion about internal validity, but there's obviously this issue of external validity, and Javier alluded to this. This massive bias or incentive for novelty in academia means that we're really often not getting the replications that we need, and people are not sort of understanding the value of having multiple studies on the same thing. I often sort of tell policymakers when I'm advising them, I say one of the sort of shorthands I say is don't make any big decision based on one study. How do we sort of from your chair at Campbell, sort of emphasize the importance of synthesis?
Well, I think I'd just start off by saying systematic reviews are really important. I mean, and that's particularly why we're doing a whole range of them on some of the most contentious subjects on preventing terrorism and radicalization, because there's been a huge growth in research since 9/11. A huge amount of money has been expended, and yet nobody seemed to have clear answers about what actually had worked in that 20 years worth of research and policy. And we've had to get governments to drag out literally corpses in terms of their pieces of research which demonstrated that things didn't work, in order to be able to add those together. But equally, just in terms of the ability to appreciate how well done some of the experiments are, and to be able to just be confident about the quality of it. That's another reason why decent, preferably multi-country systematic reviews are worth doing, and they're worth translating into practitioner language in order to encourage people at least to get a starting point. I mean, problem solving, 35% reduction in crime across a whole range of jurisdictions. It's a pretty good place for a senior police leader, a politician, a community to start in terms of, well, what would you start with? Well, I'd start with problem solving. It's a pretty good place to go.
Absolutely. Rachel, any thoughts on this subject here?
Well, one thing that I want to say is that, Peter, picking up from what you were talking about, very often that is just a door opener, right? So very often having something that says, in X number of places, this demonstrated X effect, it doesn't mean that you're going to take that and cookie cutter apply it. What it does mean is that you pique attention, right? And you get those individuals who have the ability to put something into place, whether that's your mayor or your police chief or what have you. You get their attention, and then you engage in the conversation about what some of the components of that can look like in a particular locale. And I think very often where this discussion goes off the rails is it gets into a sort of false dichotomy between, well, everything has to be localized and totally innovative and created from the ground up, versus we know exactly what works and we're just going to take it and apply it. And frankly, neither of those is right. We're constantly borrowing from people in all aspects of our lives, right, including in this. And we're constantly taking that and adapting it. And so I think there's a huge benefit to sharing this knowledge, but sharing it in the right way. And this goes back to some of the points of what we've heard from our city partners, is it's share the information with us and then, kind of accompany us in a process of thinking through what this means for our particular context in our particular city and what adaptations are required. And that's just hugely important.
Thank you, Rachel. Those are really great points. One of the things that, one of the issues I often try to think about data sort of from the policymaker's position and then work my way backwards. And, Peter, as you said, we have to be careful not to say that everything is important, or that we need to boil the ocean, because that's simply not realistic for policymakers who are operating in an atmosphere of scarcity. You have to provide information about what is most important and how to focus on that. And so in terms of data, I'm really intrigued, Peter, by the crime harm index. But everything we know about community violence, which is the area that I focus in, is that there are these concentrations, that there are these tight clusters of people and places who are driving this problem. I suspect that there are similar phenomena. There's this sort of power curve phenomenon in many other areas of social dysfunction and crime and violence. And so we need data and statistics to help us identify those concentrations. And then the research can tell us how to effectively address those concentrations. Any thoughts on that? On how to make
I noticed that one of the questions that's gone down from Angela Me to the panelists is about the types of crime we haven't mentioned so far. So organized crimes, for example, that are clearly working in areas like cyber scams, etc. We've taken the same model and applied it in a whole range of different areas, and it pretty much works. And critically, it is back to your, we constantly tell our senior police leaders, you've got to focus on the 2%, because there's a limit to the amount of intrusive powers that any state wants to be wielding if you're going to comply with it and support the rule of law. The evidence-based policing for me is fundamentally a philosophy about targeting the use of the most intrusive interventions to the places where there is the strongest justification, and trying to encourage as many non-intrusive community-based solutions to problems that are much lower in harm. And that seems to me to free up some of the thinking about different types of solutions across different types of problem. And above all, it gets the police out of some of the areas where I think quite justifiably the argument is made is that they're spending too much of their time. They're spending too much of their time dealing with mental illness, for example, when there are definitely health solutions. They're spending too much of their time dealing with substance abusers when actually there's health solutions. The more that you think about these things in terms of different cuts at different ways of thinking about harm, the more it seems to me that it frees up different approaches and different problem-solving approaches. And above all, back to Rachel's point about the rule of law, it supports a rule of law approach in which the state restricts its desire, its ability, and its focus on using heavy powers in order to solve problems like these in particularly urban environments.
I think that's a great point. And just to Angela's question regarding organized crime and gangs, I think a lot of this is a capacity issue. One thing that I think we know is that when our state systems, including but not limited to law enforcement, are limited in terms of capacity, they often take the path of least resistance, and so they do the easy thing. And in some cases, they end up almost being performative, meaning that they sort of want to appear as if they're doing something when they're not actually. And so, in the United States, or in other places as well, Peter, as you said, you can make a few busts, take pictures of yourself next to, drugs and weapons seized, but you're not necessarily getting to the heart of the problem. You're not working your way up the chain. And so I think that one thing that's very important is you need to build the capacity, the intelligence capacity, which is another type of information, for these law enforcement organizations to be sophisticated enough not to just take the crime that's presented to them, but to actually burrow into the crime, the organized crime, and more sophisticated crime that's better at avoiding. The other thing I would say is that this really ties to Rachel's point, which is that we have to be concerned with issues of legitimacy and equity, because ultimately, if you want information, people have to talk to you, and if people don't trust you, then they won't talk to you, and ultimately, that information is the lifeblood, I think, of modern enforcement and public safety. So with that, I want to get to some of the questions here. There's a question from an audience member. Peter, I think this is directed to you. Have the overall results of applying the index in different places or periods been consistent? Would it be possible to obtain the methodology for the application of this index?
Well, let's start with the methodology. It's open access. And we've got several published articles. I mean, the one I put on my slides was the first approach, the first model which we developed for England and Wales. The methodology is in the article. There are articles about the development of similar indices with a slightly different methodology because of the nature of the criminal justice systems in Australia, Hong Kong, in Scandinavia. So therefore we've got a pretty reasonable spread, and we've also thought our way through, because it was something I presented actually to Narendra Modi back just before the pandemic intervened. Was the idea of a harm index for India using kind of similar methodology. So the methodology is open. Happy for anyone to send us an email and ask us how to do it. And in terms of the other thing I'd say, because there's clearly some questions, can you apply it beyond recorded crime? Yes, there are ways of doing it. You mentioned applying it, for example, to intelligence products or to community intelligence. We've also tried to develop, we have developed methods for weighting community harms as well. And there you're tending to use more survey-based methodologies, but it's perfectly possible to do it. The key philosophical approach here is that not all crimes and harms are equal, and you're trying to encourage a focus on those that are most harmful, at least as the starting point, and also to try and encourage the use of the formal powers on those things that are at the most harmful end, and those victims most harmed, those offenders who are potentially most harmful.
Absolutely. I often spend a lot of time urging policymakers to sort of focus on these high harm things, most particularly homicide across various forms of crime and violence. I want to turn to you, Javier. There's a question that's a good one, which asks, shouldn't we apply the criteria of feasibility that you've raised, institutional, financial, technical, to evaluation as well?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, this is the transparency and the rigor of science, right? It has to be accountable, has to be transparent. Anyone should be able to audit whatever you claim is true or not. It's not only by replicating your own research, but by having many more multiple independent efforts being applied to one specific locale. Peter mentioned the importance of having lots of RCTs, about 200. Most of those are probably concentrated in developed countries, Western democracies. Do those travel to some other non-developed countries? We need a lot more evidence on that. We need people who actually conduct that research professionally, rigorously, in collaboration with government agencies. So yeah, definitely we need to apply those criteria for the science itself. Science not always, or not all disciplines have equal conventions on transparency and open science. Fortunately, that is changing as well.
Thank you, Javier. Rachel, this is a pretty broad question, but you know, do you see an increase in political violence, and what do you think is a potential response to that? And also, sort of pulling in another question from the chat, you know, what's the media's role in all of this? You're getting all the easy ones.
Okay, so let me get my head around the political violence one first by responding to the media one, which I apparently mistakenly wrote an answer to in the Q&A box because I can't figure out where to write and where not to write. But I think, look, there are multiple different ways that journalism and media and others, right, civil society organizations, human rights defenders can shine a light again on what's happening. The two examples that I put into the chat box, one is a conversation that we have here in the US quite a bit, which is that in discussions of mass violence in this country, the media tends to focus most on school shootings or on mass violent incidences that are more kind of random. In other words, aren't taking place sort of on a daily basis. But in fact, there are instances of 3 to 4 people being shot happening on a nearly continuous basis, by which I mean daily, in this country that are not getting media attention. And those tend to concentrate in communities of color and social kind of exclusion around this country. And so what that does is it focuses the attention of politicians in a particular direction and away from the more regular day in, day out violence that in fact is doing greater harm. From one perspective. So that's one role of media. Another is, you know, if you don't have media, journalists, human rights defenders, others who are doing investigative journalism into the ways in which political leaders at various levels may be complicit with or receiving rents or kickbacks from criminal actors, then you don't know what's happening, right? And so it continues and it gets worse, and your democracy erodes and the human rights of individuals erodes. And we see this again all over the world and multiple examples. So I think there are many, many different ways that journalists, media, investigators, and others are crucial here. On the question of political violence, it is increasing. I wish I had the data right here. I don't, I can get it. Somebody on this call probably does have the data at hand. I just didn't come prepared for it. And also we need to to be careful about sort of how we're defining political violence. But if you include in your definition of political violence, not just capture of state systems, but the intentional influencing of political systems to reinforce power, then there's a real increase. People often get, it's sort of a confusing moment because in fact, many groups of various different definitional labels are not intentionally trying to capture state systems. They're not intentionally trying to put themselves into positions of national or state or department level government position. They are just trying to be influential at those levels and make sure that those individuals in those positions are reinforcing their power position. So that, if you include in your definition of political violence, there is an increase. And this is again where we need to have people shining a light on that. And if we don't, then what we tend to do is again, not hold accountable our political leaders and our political institutions to their roles as working on behalf of the people, but instead we focus just on an organized crime group over here and not the way in which the president is receiving money from that group, and I'm simplifying here for effect, and the way in which that group is in fact a puppet master over the decisions and policies of the president, and that influences everything across the board.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's see. One final question, which is, what kind of solutions would you propose for governments to prevent future increases of more violence and crime? Is there any effective policy, effective measure for them? And what are the more successful countries doing versus the less successful countries? I think that's a very broad question, and I'll take a sort of very quick swing, but initially. And I think let's do a lightning round here because we're almost out of time. But I think there's really I think two sort of major issues here. I think one is the overall level of cohesion in a society. Some societies, based on history, based on all various factors, are extremely cohesive. Which means that the social bonds are much tighter, and so those social bonds sort of control criminal behavior. And then the other is simply capacity. Some countries have more resources, and importantly, have had more resources for longer. So they have been able to develop over time more sophisticated responses. Often, when I see issues in certain Latin American nations that are struggling with high levels of corruption and brutality, I think that really was the United States 125 years ago. And we were really in no different a position. It was just we possibly had more time to develop solutions. So I would say cohesion and capacity are two big factors. Javier?
On my perspective, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all response to such a big question. I think solutions have to come bottom up instead of top down. And that comes from listening to people on the ground because they have so much experience dealing with these problems. And sometimes they feel frustrated that they cannot implement innovative policies. And maybe that's an opportunity for academia to partner with these champions at the local level who have the insight of what might work and try to come up with a system of providing evidence that actually providing support, empirical, robust support for those things. I think that's where the conversation has to start, to build up different responses to local problems that eventually can scale up or replicate or mutate to different locales or contexts.
Thank you, Javier. Very quickly, Rachel.
Very quickly. agree on your point, Thomas, about cohesion. And I would say that collaboration is a demonstration of cohesion, and where people are more cohesive, there's more likelihood to collaborate, which is an ingredient for success. I would say focusing on the facilitators of violence. So I include in here weapons and different types of weapons, small arms in particular of different capacity. But there are other facilitators of violence as well that successful states focus on. An inherent sort of respect for human rights, let's not leave that out. Where you have that, then across the board, you tend to see less harmful practices, whether it's the 7 years in pretrial detention or something else, but an inherent respect for human rights. And then the last point is that I sort of don't like this question only because I think sometimes we do this at country level, and that can shadow over the fact that very often what seems to be working at country level, in fact, isn't working for many people if you go subnationally and you look within a country. And I think the US is a great example of this, where for a long time people would say what was being done, that the US was doing well. The murder of George Floyd really shined a light on the fact that for many people in this country, we weren't doing so well. And now that's kind of better known. And so when we talk about these sort of comparisons and like, what are countries doing well, we really need to interrogate that much more specifically, I think.
Great point, absolutely. Peter, you have the final word.
Okay, I got given 90 minutes to try and answer this question in front of Narendra Modi and the entire corpus of the senior Indian police service at their annual conference in Pune just before the pandemic. And a lot of the things that we've raised here were there. So, start with data, get the best data you can, and the data from multiple sources. Invest in the leadership of not just the police, but other institutions. Invest in the best community governance that you can, because actually you need people to be able to hold folk to account. Invest in problem solving. Invest in simple solutions. For example, trying to tackle corruption on the streets in Hyderabad. Simple body-worn cameras on cops stops the traffic officers taking bribes. You're changing the expectation. So arrange, and I gave him 10 steps I mean, obviously the pandemic intervened, but the one thing that we've just to final wrap up, the one thing we've learned from the pandemic in the research I've been doing for UNODC and others is just how common the problems are across the world that were faced by police forces, which gives me heart to say that some of the solutions that we've got are capable of being applied in different places, as long as we're thoughtful about the context.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Javier. Thanks to our host, UNODC, and thanks to all of you. We'll leave it there.